Okay, part two, we are going to dive further into speaking about the central nervous system and the brains and the layer of the meninges and some more terms and definitions. So let's get started. Again, the brain and spinal cord is what makes up the central nervous system. So let's start by talking about the meninges. So the meninges are membranes that cover the brain and spinal cord. So know what meninges are. So first we have the dura mater. So think tough mother. So the dura mater is going to be the most superficial layer. So that means closest to the top. So we're going to use this. We'll color code it. And this is our dura mater. So we'll say DM. And then we have the arachnoid matter, so spider-like. So the most middle layer, think spider-like mother. It is going to have blood vessels underneath it in the subarachnoid space. So let's put this up here. So we have, these are going to touch, and this is going to be the arachnoid matter. And then we have this little area called the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space. And then our last layer is going to be the pia mater. I'm not sure why it's not on here, but the pia mater. So that's going to be right here, and it directly connects with the brain, and it cannot be removed. So when we do brain surgeries and even like in a cadaver lab, it's directly connected with the brain. So there's not space like the subarachnoid space. So this picture is in your book, and it's on page 238. So this is just a visualization of what we just talked about. So we have the cerebrum here, which is the wavy like matter on the outside of your brain, the wrinkly part. And then you have the pia mater, and this is directly attached to the brain. This is what's going to bring it blood and vessels and structures. And then you have the subarachnoid space in between the pia mater and the arachnoid. So the arachnoid matter is here, and then the dura mater is on the outside. So maybe create a mnemonic or something that will help you remember the order of the layer of meninges. Okay, so meninges also cover the spinal cord as well. The dura mater most outside, the arachnoid matter, the subarachnoid space, and the pia mater are also always going to be the same. But here we have the epidural space, and that's going to contain the blood vessels, fatty tissues, and connective tissues surrounding the spinal cord. Okay, so we have an added space, and think epidural when you get an epidural medication wise. That is where they're placing that needle, that very sensitive space. Here we have all the layers again. So dura mater outside, it's going to be the thickest membrane of them all. Arachnoid is going to be web-like and very, very delicate. That's going to sit in between the two. Then you have the subarachnoid space, and then pia mater. So I really like this here, this tissue model. So you have skull, and then the skull is directly attaching to the dura mater, and then you have the arachnoid mater, and then you have that subarachnoid space that's going to have the cerebral spinal fluid. So you see how it's kind of webby here. It's very delicate. And then we're going to have blood vessels in that space. And then we have the pia mater that's very thin. And then the cerebrum, or the brain. On the spinal cord side, we have the epidural space here. And that's where our cerebral spinal fluid is going to be. We have a ligament here that's going to just protect all of these tissues inside, just an extra layer against the body of, or excuse me, against the vertebrae here. And then we have the epidural space. And then we start with what's easier to see on this side, the dura mater, which is going to be the very outside, the thickest, that blue. And the arachnoid mater is that very thin gray, delicate tissue here. And the subarachnoid space is still in the spinal cord. And then we have the spinal cord in the middle. But off of the spinal cord is when we start to have the nerves that are the ganglia that come off the spinal cord so that we can send those messages. The epidural space is something that is different between the brain and protecting that with the meninges and the spinal cord and being protected by the meninges. The epidural space is not found in the brain. It's only with the spinal cord. And it is the space between the vertebrae, so the bone, and the dura mater. In the brain, the dura mater is directly in contact with the skull. So know that there is a space called the epidural space between the vertebrae, the bone, and the dura mater. Within that space, we're going to have blood vessels, adipose tissue, and that ligament, that loose connective tissue that allows for movement. And that ligament's going to help lubricate and move the blood vessels and protect those structures. And so that epidural space is also used to give anesthetics, so pain meds and neuromuscular blocking meds, so that we can numb areas of the body. So think of having an epidural when a woman is in labor. The subarachnoid space, on the other hand, is also a space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. So remember, pia is directly touching either the brain or the spinal cord, and the arachnoid mater is right after the dura mater. So the subarachnoid space is present in both the spinal cord and the brain, because this is where we're going to have our cerebral spinal fluid. And that's going to help with messages, and we're going to talk more about that here in a minute. Okay, so cerebral spinal fluid is also just known as CSF. So this clear fluid is surrounding the spinal cord and the brain and is made by ependymal cells, which line cavities in the brain, in the center of the brain, called ventricles. We will talk more about the anatomy of the brain, but right now the ventricles are in the middle of the brain, and they are made by these cells. They're secreted and they move between the brain and the spinal cord and the ventricles, and it continues to bathe the brain and spinal cord. We're going to get into the function of CSF here in a minute, but this clear colorless fluid is something that's going to, without this, the functions, the brain would not be able to process properly, and it would not be able to maintain its health as long. So it would age faster. This is something that we look for, and it should only be in the subarachnoid space, right? So cerebral spinal fluid should only be in the subarachnoid space. If we have a patient who comes in with a trauma or a bad blow to the head or something like that, we're going to look for leaking of the cerebral spinal fluid. It can come out the nose, it can come out of the mouth, it can come out of the eyes, the ears. It can come out of like a gunshot wound or a puncture wound near the spine. So in emergency medicine, we'll do something that's called the halo test. And if we have somebody that is bleeding from, let's say, their head, they had a car accident and they have a big gash in their head, and we suspect skull fractures, and it was pretty intense, Um, and you put a piece of gauze on it and you hold it there for a minute and you take it off. Cerebral spinal fluid is so thin that it'll spread out farther than blood on a piece of gauze. And you'll have this like yellow, clearish yellow ring around the blood. And then you know that there's cerebral spinal fluid. And that indicates that, okay, we've got a severe head wound here. They're usually not going to be alert and awake and responsive. Um, so that will tell us how to treat the patient and diagnostic tests to obtain. So the functions, know the functions of CSF. So provide buoyancy. So allows our brain to kind of float in our head, right? Our brain is dense and heavy, and without that weight lifted, it would just sit at the bottom of our skull and it would become damaged. It provides protection, right? It's going to absorb some of the force or shock from trauma or an accident. It's going to help facilitate chemical stability. So it helps remove and regulate waste that is in the brain and the spinal cord. Therefore, it's going to help us maintain homeostasis. So it removes excess hydrogen ions. So when we talk about acid-base balance, hydrogen ions are bicarb, would make us more alkalotic. Okay, so it's going to help reduce that. It also provides nutrients because it's constantly moving and it's going across the brain and the spinal cord and back to the ventricles. It can carry nutrients with it as well to help feed areas of our central nervous system. So make sure that you understand and know this is not the page. This is going to be page 241. You know what the functions of cerebral spinal fluid are. Okay, let's dive deeper into the brain. So again, we kind of talked about this a little bit. We have the cerebrum here, and then we have the diencephalon here. The brain stem starts here and continues down until it meets with and becomes the spinal cord, and then the cerebellum in the back. And we're going to dive into each of these areas further. So the cerebrum is the outermost part of the brain. When you hear something termed gray matter, you will think of the brain or the spinal cord because it is a gray color. So if you are called and you are in the emergency room and you're responding to a gunshot wound and gray matter is showing, a gunshot wound specifically to the head, you know that there's brain and it's herniating out of the skull. So the cerebrum is characterized by those grooves and folds called sulci. So know that will be found on the cerebrum, and it's divided into two hemispheres, the left and the right. And we are divided by this longitudinal fissure here. So the purpose of these grooves and folds are to help us increase surface area. So without these grooves and folds, we wouldn't have as complex of brains, which means we wouldn't be as developed and evolved as we are today. So know that these are both developed for larger surface area. So in between the right and left hemisphere, so there is a connective tissue that's holding them together. And this is called the corpus callosum. And it is a white connective tissue. And the reason that it is white and not gray is because it is covered with myelinated axons, right? So this allows the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere to talk to each other and share messages with one another. So I spoke about the gray matter earlier, and that part of the brain is called the cortex. This is where we have conscious thoughts and voluntary actions, and the majority of the brain is actually composed of this gray matter. The rest of the rest of the cerebrum is composed of white matter, meaning that it has myelinated axons carrying the messages. So conscious thought and gray matter is going to be the most outer part of the brain that has the folds and the grooves, and it's going to be gray matter. The connective tissue and the rest of the cerebrum is going to be white matter. So the cerebrum is divided into four major lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and then insula, which not much is known about the insula. It lies deep, deep within the cerebrum, and they're still studying it. Okay, let's talk about the frontal lobe. So premotor in the frontal lobe plans the messages, and then that goes to the primary, and the primary sends efferent. So efferent exit messages to the skeletal muscles. It's thought that motivation and aggression are located here. Also, the personality as well, judgment. So it's important to understand that when you're working with patients with like traumatic brain injuries, that you understand where injuries are. Sometimes if we have a brain bleed or something happens to specific areas of the lobe, we can decide how we're going to treat them. We know kind of how to predict what their treatment plan is going to be, or a personality might change, and that's something that we can prepare our treatment for, and also families as well. It is also going to contain Broca's area for language. So speech production, articulation. Think about how you form words and the muscles that you use in your face and your mouth to help you form words. So not just processing, but muscle movement as well. So the parietal lobe, which is the yellow lobe here, is going to be where we have our senses, sense of touch, even smell, taste. We have nerves that are in the nasal cavities, at the tips of our fingers, all over our body, that are going to be responsive to that. The dendrites can sense it. They send that message to the brain. The parietal lobe processes it and then sends the message back out on how to react. The temporal lobe is going to be what processes what we hear. It's pretty easy to remember that as it's near the ear. So it also contains Wernicke's area for language. So this is how we're going to hear language, how we're going to process it, and then how we react to it. Occipital lobe in the back of your head is where we are going to process what we see through our vision. This is just a really good infographic to kind of help you put everything together. The parietal lobe, frontal, occipital, temporal, the cerebellum, and the brainstem, and kind of what they control. Let's go over the diencephalon, which contains the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and is very important for us to understand as RTs. So the thalamus is important for us because it is going to get those incoming messages from the spinal cord, and it is going to be like a switchboard. It's going to direct traffic. Okay, well, here is language. Now I'm going to send you to the temporal lobe, or I am seeing this really bright light and I really think we should turn it off, but that's not my decision, so I'm going to send you to the occipital lobe. So the thalamus's function is to send the message to the proper part of the brain. The hypothalamus is responsible for maintaining homeostasis. There are several ways that it does this. The first being temperature regulation. So it's constantly monitoring temperature regulation. So if the body's temperature becomes too hot, it's going to have you produce sweat. If it becomes too cold to cool, it's going to have you shiver, and that shivering is going to increase metabolism and create heat. It also performs autonomic functions such as controlling heart rate, blood vessel diameter. So if our blood pressure is too low, so if we have hypotension, it's going to make our blood vessels constrict. And if we constrict it, that's going to increase our blood pressure. If our blood pressure is too high, it's going to try and dilate those vessels and decrease our heart rate, our heart rate and our blood pressure. So the hypothalamus also produces hormones, the hormone ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. So there are several axes that we'll talk about in later chapters. So that deals with the endocrine system and regulates the pituitary gland and further hormone production. So right now, just know that it produces antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. The hypothalamus also is going to monitor blood glucose and amino acid levels, and then it's going to tell us if we're hungry. So if you're sitting there studying and all of a sudden your stomach gurgles, the hypothalamus has sensed that your blood sugars are getting low and that you need to eat something so that you can maintain homeostasis. It's also going to look at solutes and blood cells, and it's going to tell us, okay, we need to drink something. Our electrolyte levels are off, or if it's our blood levels, there's too many red blood cells, and our blood volume isn't where it should be, we're going to become incredibly thirsty. And the last function of the hypothalamus is sexual development. So it stimulates sexual development and puberty, and the brain is always changing, and it is also responsible for sexual arousal. So the brainstem is composed of 4 parts: the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata. It's my favorite thing to say. And then for reticular formation as well. A common misconception is that the brainstem goes out the bottom of the skull, when actually it is not outside the skull whatsoever. Only the spinal cord will be below the skull. So the brainstem does not extend beyond the cranial cavity into the neck. So the midbrain appears and looks like a hook, and its primary functions are responsible for visual and auditory reflexes. On the brainstem, we have 4 bulges called the colliculi, and these are going to be what sends the messages for auditory and vision outside of the body. So the 2 superior colliculi are important for visual reflexes, so tracking movement, focusing on something that you see off to the side, peripheral vision, etc. The 2 inferior colliculi are important for auditory reflexes. So when you hear a sound to one side of you and you turn your head, that is where that is coming from. Or when you jump from a loud noise, again, that would be those 2 inferior colliculi. So the pons is a bridge of communication for efferent motor messages, so exit messages to the skeletal muscles from the cerebellum. So whatever lobe is responsible for that function will send the message to the spinal cord, and it is going to cross the pons. Anyway, it'll cross the pons and go to the spinal cord, and then we will have that message. So the medulla oblongata is going to regulate autonomic functions such as heart rate and blood pressure and respiratory rate. It is the most inferior part of the brainstem. So when we have damage to this, or we have a brain herniation, or we have something that happens so that there's swelling in the brain and the skull is compressing against that brain stem, we risk losing all of these functions because we no longer can adequately send messages to these organs. It's also important to note that drugs that are given and prescribed, or even anesthesia or sedation, alcohol, these can affect our functions and decrease respiratory rate because it's working with neurotransmitters and the electricity of the brain to help different areas. But these drugs aren't selective to specific one lobe in the brain. So if we are trying for sedation or trying to keep someone calm, it's not just going to work on maybe the frontal lobe to decrease aggression. It will affect the entire brain. Therefore, it's going to affect things like heart rate and blood pressure and respiratory rate. So just keep that in mind. So reticular formation is a group of cells that is located throughout the brainstem that is responsible for the sleep and wake cycle. It's what keeps our circadian rhythm. If it's not working, then the body shuts down and the brain shuts down, and that's what results in coma. It's important for sensory things such as arousal. It determines what's going to be noticed by the cerebrum and what messages need to be sent. The cerebellum is the last subdivision of the brain. So it maintains coordination and balance, our physical skeletal muscle movement. So it's going to receive those sensory messages. It's hot, it's cold, something sharp, it hurts even, but also things feel good, or that's soft, or that's rough, and it will send a message back on how to position limbs, any reactions we need to make based on these sensory messages that we're receiving. So it's good to note here, alcohol can affect the cerebellum. So too much tequila, you can't see straight, and then you're kind of wobbling, and then you fall down, and bad things can happen. There are many great videos on TikTok involving alcohol and the cerebellum. So moving on to the spinal cord, you need to know that there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So pairs, one will go to the left side, one will go to the right side. And they are attached at the spinal cord between the vertebrae. Okay, and we have it subdivided like we talked during our skeletal system: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral. So cervical, remember, C3, C4, C5, keep a guy alive. Okay, so that's where the nerves are going to come out that innervate our diaphragm. Again, a function of our spinal cord is to send messages to and from the brain, right? And to and from the body. So ascending, so going up to the brain, we have afferent messages. Descending, exiting the brain, going to the body, we have efferent. Okay, so here's a picture. So we can see where our nerves are going to innervate specific organs or parts of the body. So C2, diaphragm, right? C1, head and neck. C3, C4, and C5 are going to be around the shoulders and the arms. The reason we say C3, C4, C5 is because you can see it's not exactly across here. But if we have an injury anywhere in here, we risk inflammation and cutting off blood flow to that part of um, the spinal cord. So then anything above that injury is at risk for reacting and causing a decrease in function for other areas. So be sure to read this chapter, chapter 6, to page 256, and then we will continue and finish the rest of the nervous system on Monday.